Okay, so everybody all set? You should have I believe it's lesson 11. It's the Christian Law Code Part 2. Everybody got what they need for that? All righty. Okay, so thank you to Donnie for completing that lesson for us. That was a quite lengthy lesson that we were working through. We had to really lay the ground about the difference between the law system and the law code. And so understanding that can we try to sum it up? Can we sum up the difference between the law code and the law system? You guys think we can give that a shot? Anybody want to give it a try? When we say law system, what do we mean? Okay, so what? Okay, it is, but it's also a code. But what's the difference? What distinguishes it as a system? Sorta. No. Sorta. Beth? Okay. So we have said that a law code has always been present since the beginning. There's always been a moral standard by which to live by, and that moral standard is in concert with the attributes of God, right? And so the law system then, when we say that would be a system by which you can be saved, right? So what's the flip side of the coin of the law system? What's on the other side of it? The law system, how many people are saved through the law system? Right? None. No, we don't say Jesus is saved because he didn't need saving, but he did fulfill the law system. So what's the flip side of that? The grace system, yes. And so when we talk about, remember the two theoretical gates in heaven? The one being the law system, the law gate, the other being the grace gate. And so as systems of salvation, the law system is bound up in the Mosaic law. So that's where you were on the right track, but it's more than what distinguishes it. Is it theoretically it's linked to the process of salvation. Now, what does the law system do for everybody? The law system, what does it do for us in relationship to salvation? Okay, it points us to Christ. What else? Okay, yeah, it teaches us what sin is, right? And by it we know that we're guilty, right? The idea of it being a tutor, you know where it's spoken of in that way? Oh, I got dual clocks tonight. Oh boy. Somebody been talking to somebody? All right, so. Except that's Michelle. Randy's in Hillsboro. Okay, so. All right, so anyway, so we have this distinction. So what we've been talking about is a law code as such, and the specifics of the Christian law code. And we've said that the law code in Christianity is it's extensive and important, and it's that which by we are to live our lives in response to our salvation. And so we looked at a number of things there at the end of chapter 4, where it's telling us, let no unwholesome word proceed from your mouth, but only such as a word is good for edification, and so forth. Do not grieve the Holy Spirit, by whom you were sealed for the day of redemption. Let all bitterness and wrath and anger and clamor and slander be put away, so forth and so on. So we talked about not being angry or being angry in the proper way. Be angry and do not sin. Speak truth and all this good stuff. So tonight we're going to pick up with chapter 5, and we're going to look at verses 5 and 6. So it continues these ideas that are tied to our law code. So it says this, therefore, be imitators of God as beloved children, and walk in love, just as Christ also loved you and gave himself up for us, an offering, a sacrifice to God, as a fragrant aroma. But do not let immorality or any impurity or greed even be named among you, as is proper among saints. And there must be no filthiness and silly talk or coarse jesting, which are not fitting, but rather giving of thanks. For this you know with certainty, that no immoral or impure person or covetous man who is an idolater has an inheritance in the kingdom of Christ and God. Let no one deceive you with empty words, for because of these things the wrath of God comes upon the sons of disobedience. Now, in the introduction to the previous lesson, we talked about the nature of the Christian law code. In that lesson, we explained in Ephesians chapter 4, 25 through 32, which is a brief segment of our law code. The present text here in chapter 5, verses 1 through 6, gives us a few more commandments, which all of God's human creatures are supposed to obey. It also tells us what it is like to live as a lawkeeper in the presence of our Creator and lawgiver. So what are some of these specific instructions that we find about how to live? And then we find these primarily in verses 3 through 5. Now, as in the previous section, the commandments Paul addresses to us here are mostly negative or positive. Are they do's or don'ts? They've been mostly don'ts, right? They're mostly negative. They name sinful actions and attitudes that we must try our best to avoid. As is true of all the Creator's commands, are these guidelines? Are these suggestions? These are commands. Remember back to our English lesson? Yeah, these are statements or interrogatives. What is this? Imperative, yeah. They're imperatives. These are imperatives. And so, as is true of all the Creator's commands, these are not suggestions, they are prohibitions that we are morally obligated to obey. So the first one of these, in verses 3 and 5, we find, when it talks about immorality or impurity, it's do not commit sexual or immorality and impurity. Now, the first prohibition reminds us of the seventh of the 10 commandments. You shall not commit adultery. Now, here's the command is brought in to forbid all kinds of sexual sin, including adultery. Sexual immorality and all impurity must not be even named among you. Everyone who is sexually immoral or impure has no inheritance in the kingdom of Christ and God. Now, we talk about sexual relations between a husband and a wife within the marriage relationship is a good gift of the Creator, but it is intended to be used and enjoyed only within marriage. Therefore, a man shall leave his father and mother and hold fast to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. Ephesians 5:31, quoting Genesis 2:24. A large part of the Creator's law code governs how we human beings are supposed to use this gift. The heart of it all is that God's law forbids all sexual activity outside a marriage relationship between a man and a woman. When we talk about God's design for this aspect of humankind, would you say that a vast majority of the world and our society and what Satan has done believes in this? Let's think about this for a minute. What do you think is the percentage in this day and age of people who would say, one man, one woman, married, and this is the context for any kind of sexual relations? What percentage of society do you think would say, yep, that's what it is? It's not much, right? So what is the context of Now let's narrow this even further. What do you think the percentages would be within the church? Should be what? 100, right? How you say it? 100? Yeah. That's what Danny says to Angie. Give me 100. Yeah. Within the church, do you think it's 100%? Now, what is the justification? I mean, there's a number of verses in Scripture. In fact, we just stated here that a great portion of the law code that's spelled out for us throughout the whole Bible and in the New Testament, the Christian law code, has a lot to do with this aspect of our existence. So the question would be, what justification then exists for people in the church saying, not that big a deal? How do they justify? How do they say, I know what it says, but what do we hear? What's the justification? What's that? God's love? Don't judge. Who are we to judge, right? So that's used, but God's love. Follow that line of thought. What's the justification? Okay, grace. God will understand. How does this usually specifically stated? Do they bring God into it even in the church? What do they say? Okay, so things have changed. Get with the times, right? Right? They say they take a progressive look at this document and say that it is needs to change with the times, which is hilarious because I don't know about you, but Sodom and Gomorrah was a long time ago. Yes. Okay. So that's the idea here is that God is love. Yeah, and that's what others were saying too. You guys are definitely on the right track, but I want to narrow this a little further. When someone says, "What's the problem?" They're two people. Not hurting anybody. No. I mean, ultimately, we can trace everything back to that. Don't they say, love is love? We should be able to love. If it's two people who love each other, and it's beautiful between those, what difference does it make? You guys ever hear that? Is that not the justification? Look, I've seen this happen. And we've seen, and if I were to do a little bit of research on this, I think you'll find this. The more that the church accepts alternative lifestyles, as it's put, right? The more we'll have Christians who look at family members and loved ones and say, man, these are really good people. I mean, my son, my cousin, my aunt, my uncle, that's the nicest people in the world. And their relationship with so-and-so is, I mean, they really love one another, so it must be okay. Haven't we all seen this? I don't know anybody that's immune to this, and this is what's happening. So what happens with one of two things happens. One is we justify it, and we try to twist Scripture, or they just leave the faith altogether within Christianity. You know, I'm done with it. What we're seeing with these famous thought leaders or worship leaders that have been leaving Christianity, they call it, they're going through deconstruction is what they call it. That's the fancy term. Almost every one of them I see, it's because they're having a struggle with how they think about these alternative lifestyles and all the letters. And they almost always say, man, I know so-and-so, and they love Jesus. Right? So certainly it's okay. And so much of what we see here in the law code is pointing to this. Why? Because it's one of Satan's greatest tools. There's a lot of things he uses within our desires, right? We talk about that passage in 1 John that talks about sin. It has to do with what? Lust of the eyes, lust of the flesh, the boastful pride of life, right? I mean, sexual nature of us has to deal with all that, doesn't it? And it's so powerful, and he uses it, and when things are perverted, it's so dark and so far from the light of God's Word. It's sad. See, the heart of it all is that God's law forbids all sexual activity outside a marriage relationship between a man and a woman. The general term translated sexual immorality is the Greek word porneia. Some Bible versions regularly translate this word as fornication, an English word that is usually limited to premarital sex. Porneia can refer to this, but it is usually meant to include any and all forms of sexual sins, which include fornication. You can see how it's used, for example, in Matthew 19:9, Acts 15:20, Galatians 5:19, and 1 Thessalonians 4:3. Now, in Matthew 19:9, it certainly includes adultery, but can include other sexual sins such as pornography addiction and homosexual activity. Now, Clinton Arnold says that sexual sin was rampant in the pagan world in which the church began and from which most of the Ephesian Christians were drawn, right? What's going on in Ephesus? Remember the context of everything that's happening here, right? What was the worldview and what was taking place in and around town that these Christian people now used to be a part of? What was it? Temple worship, specifically Diana and Artemis. And so there were things that were present in and around the temple, male and female, temple prostitutes, and this was done, and all these abominable things were done in the name of worship. Now, what kind of, anybody recall kind of what this statue looked like? What was kind of symbolic of? Everybody's like, oh, I don't know. A naked lady? Did you say naked again? Okay, actually, it related to fertility. Were you all saying that? Okay, and so this thing had many. It's just kind of a grotesque in the way it was described. Many breasts on it. Just up and down and all over it and all that kind of stuff, symbolizing fertility. It's naked, yes. Yeah. Maybe God had a plan why Facebook wasn't working tonight. What's that? What?
I think Satan's interfered tonight because of this lesson.
Oh, that could be. That could be. So when we talk about the Greek and the way that it's understood here, that we understand that the pagan culture to what they were immersed in, and this is what they used to be used to, and now they're told flee and abstain from anything outside of one man and one woman in the context of marriage. This is a drastic change for them. And so we talk about that pagan culture, and this is what they were drawn from, this adulterous relationships, men sleeping with their slave girls, incest, prostitution, sacred sexual encounters in the local temples, and homosexuality were all part of everyday life. So you think of, and this is uncomfortable, but you think of things that are done in darkness. You know, maybe in our society and culture now, it's things like these are done in darkness, not so much anymore. It's like more and more in the light, right? But there was a time when you speak of any of these things, it was in darkness. Are you with me? This was their everyday life. I mean, you're just going by the temple, pa-da, right? There it is. This was normal. And so unfortunately, this was rampant sexual immorality. It was rampant. Now, this is the sensuality mentioned in 4:19. So if you go back to 4:19, it says, and some having callously given themselves over to sensuality. This is what that's talking about when we talked about in chapter 4, verse 19. Now, sadly, this description of ancient paganism reminds us of what? Reminds us of the sexual culture of our own day, especially that which is depicted in our entertainment media. This is one of the main reasons. Think about this for a minute. There are a lot of world religions out there, right? A lot of worldviews. In our current day and age, there's a certain worldview, world religion that hates Western culture for this very reason. What is that? Islam. Islam hates Western culture a lot because, it's fascinating that this is one of the main reasons why Islam formally attacks and rejects Western culture because of the rampant sexual immorality. Now, the other word Paul uses to represent the same kind of sin is akatharsia, translated impurity. Now, this word again appears in 4:19. Now, this is the word translated unclean when we're referring to the Old Testament ritual uncleanness. Now, in the New Testament, it especially refers to sexual sin and impurity as here, and there's many other passages. Romans 1:24. Now, again, what we're summing up here, again, parallel passage, is what we read in Romans chapter 1:18 and the following verses through the end of the chapter. And it's basically, in a nutshell, this, that men deny the obvious Creator and suppress that truth in unrighteousness. And the primary unrighteousness which they suppress the truth is sexual sin. That's usually the motivation for forming worldviews which have nothing to do with God and accountability. That's how that whole passage reads, if you just want to read it in a nutshell. And so what it talks about there in Romans and 2 Corinthians 12:21, 1 Thessalonians 4:7, it includes all kinds of sexual sins. Note that all impurity, exactly as he does in 4:19, as Jesus does in Matthew 23:27, when speaking of the hypocritical scribes and Pharisees. So this is, do not commit sexual immorality and impurity. That is a very important part of the Christian law code. Now, let's move on to the next one. Do not covet what belongs to someone else. The next sin Paul condemns is covetousness or greed, which both here and in 4:19 is a sin closely related to sexual impurity. The Greek word translated as either covetousness or greed refers to the desire to possess more and more of something to the point of sinful excess. In these texts, we can see that one can have such an unlimited desire for sexual activity that he or she is driven to all kinds of sins in that area. The ESV translation in 4:19 says that pagans are greedy to practice every kind of impurity. Now, the key word in covetousness thinking is this idea of more. Now, let's come back to what we said here about the sexual culture of our day and the way that it's depicted in entertainment media. Right? We said that has a lot to do with how we think about these things. What about the concept of more in culture, in our Western culture and entertainment media? How is it portrayed? Yep, you deserve it. More is better. Or are we trained to think? Are we trained for the word is there, but it's not coming out. All right, what is it? Help me. I know as soon as I start describing it, it'll come to me. When you are happy with what you got. Content. Complacent kept coming to my mind. Yeah, content. Are we trained for contentment? Are we trained against contentment? Yeah. So what is out there that trains us against contentment? Yeah, we're bombarded with anti-contentment. And I fall prey to this so much, right? I remember the day, right? They got digital television, 720p, right? Right? You guys remember that? Some of you are probably like, I have no idea what you're talking about. Right? 720p, that's a certain resolution. All right, who's with me on this one? I understand. Okay. All right. All right, you guys, all right. Then 1080p comes out, and you're like, ooh, man. And there you are standing in Walmart in front of 30 televisions going, man, look how clear that is, right? So what happens? The 720p goes to the kids' bedroom, right? Or the garage, or sadly, the church. Ooh. Y'all know how it is with the old couch. If we, right? And now they got 4K, right? And what are you thinking? Wow, I gotta have that. And it works on us, right? And sometimes we fall prey to it and we don't even realize it. We're trained against contentment. And so when we think about this desire to have more, it's this, but back to this parallel verse in chapter 4, verse 19. It's a continual lust for more. Clinton Arnold explains it as an insatiable desire to acquire more and more. It would include the love of money, right? So we've seen this. The love of money is the root of all evil, right? So money is the root of all evil, right? No, what's that saying? Love of money, yeah. Which Paul says is a root of all kinds of evil. Is that true? Yeah. It leads to what Jesus condemns in Matthew 6:19, where he's talking about laying up finite, ephemeral treasures on earth instead of the eternal and glorious treasures of heaven. I love the way Dr. Cottrell thinks. He says when he thinks of covetousness, I think of Walt Disney's character, Scrooge McDuck, right? I don't know if you guys ever seen this, but it was a cartoon when we were kids, and Scrooge was always swimming through what? His piles of gold, right? Scrooge McDuck swimming through his money bin. Now, the English word covetousness suggests a sinful element that goes beyond the quantitative desire for more. It also includes a desire to possess that which rightfully belongs to someone else. So if covetousness is the desire to possess what rightfully belongs to someone else, then it can lead to what? Specifically, what sin? Stealing, right? Stealing, you're taking something that rightfully belongs to someone else, and it's a desire. A lot of times, covetousness is included in stealing. So, now this is seen in the last of the 10 Commandments, which condemns coveting your neighbor's house, your neighbor's donkey, or anything that is your neighbor's. Such covetousness often leads to a resentful attitude towards that neighbor and possibly sinful acts against him. Now, here's just a thought. You can take this or leave it. I think that there are political movements that use this dynamic for their advantage. They breed covetousness in people for their advantage. And so we could sum that up in this concept of class warfare. They have, some have, and if you don't have, you have a right to have what they have. and we're going to make you want what they have and then take it from them and give it to you. I think socialism at its heart is based in the sin of covetousness. Now, there's some commercials out there that I think that kind of sum this up. I think it's E-Trade, right? It shows like somebody that's got it good, and that they're observing this individual in their swimming pool or something, and then the tagline is, "Don't get mad, get even." You know what that's saying? Get yours at any cost. And so that's the idea that's kind of behind all this. Now, Paul he consistently equates covetousness with some other type of sin. Idolatry. That's right. In 5:5, see? Or covetous man who is an idolater. And you see this also in Colossians 3:5. The point is that the covetous person can be thought of as actually worshiping material things, money, possessions, stuff, as a god. Jesus says the same thing in Matthew 6:24. No one can serve two masters, for he will hate the one and love the other, or he will be devoted to one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and mammon or money. Yep. Now this shows us why Paul actually says that those whose lifestyle is built around either sexual impurity or covetousness, what does it say about these individuals that share in these things? What do they share in? Their lifestyle is built around these things, and they have no inheritance in the kingdom in Christ of God. He says the same thing in 1 Corinthians 6, 9 through 10. In Galatians chapter 5, 19 through 21, all of these sins are listed as works of the flesh. Paul is not saying to Christians, if you slip and commit such a sin, you'll immediately become lost. That's important, right? We don't ever want to say that if you slip and commit a sin like this, that you're toast, you're done for, you got to start all over. It's not what we're saying. Rather, he is saying that if this is who you are, right? If this defines your behavior, if these things define your behavior, if this is your nature, what's at your heart, your lifestyle, then you're what? You're lost. Who's he writing to? He's saying if this characterizes your lifestyle and your heart, and then but I didn't, once you're in, you're always in, right? Right? I mean, once you're saved, you're always saved, right? No. We want to obey. See, here's the thing. If this is your nature, your heart, your lifestyle, you are lost. But we are Christians. We want to obey God's law code. So how could we even want to do any of these things? We have no business wanting them, doing them, or being that kind of person whatsoever, right? Back to the beginning of Romans chapter 6, verse 1, what does it say? Do we continue in these things so that grace would increase? He says, may it never be, right? And that's an emphatic statement. May it never be. All right. So thus far, we're talking about we do not commit sexual immorality or impurity. We do not covet what belongs to someone else. And now, do not use dirty, crude language. And rather, instead, thank and praise God instead. Now, here Paul returns to the subject of sinful speech, right? Now, I believe that Donnie covered some of this last week, right? Yeah, returns to the subject of sinful speech. So there's different ways that he's talking about this here. There's different aspects of the way we talk and how we talk and what spheres that we're talking in. that Paul is alluding to here. So he reminds us of the subject of sinful speech, where he talked about in chapter 4, verse 29, where he condemns rotten talk. Now, in this connection, we would cite, what's another passage of Scripture that really is an excellent description of our speech and the power therein? James chapter 3? Yeah, you're in the ballpark. Yeah, James chapter 3. James chapter 3, verses 6 through 8 talks about the tongue in some interesting ways. What are some of those metaphors off the top of your head? You guys remember? Let's see if you remember. Fire, right? So what's the idea of a fire when it talks about the tongue as a fire? It can set on the course of a person's entire life, just like it only takes one little thing to set ablaze an entire forest, right? I remember one time there was a sermon illustration that I shared that there was I believe it was a lady who stopped by the road and didn't effectively put out her cigarette, and it burnt like thousands and thousands and thousands of acres from that one little thing. And she was prosecuted for it. They were able to determine that she was responsible. I don't know if she confessed, but the financial damage and the loss of life and all the things that were surrounded by it, they just took that one little thing. What's another example that James uses? Yep, ship's rudder, right? So any of you ever been on a cruise ship? What's the scale of the rudder in connection to the rest of the ship? Not very big, right? Ships are massive. And the rudders that can guide those ships are small, so saying that the tongue, while it is small, yields great power. What's the other one that they use there? Yep, a bridle and a bit in a horse's mouth. It can control the person and guide their life, right? And so the tongue is a fire, a world of unrighteousness. The tongue is set among our members, staining the whole body, setting on fire the entire course of life, and set on fire by hell. For every kind of beast and bird and reptile and sea creature can be tamed and has been tamed by mankind, but no human being can tame the tongue. It is a restless evil, full of deadly poison. Man. Now, the kind of language Paul condemns here in 5:4 certainly fits this description. Now, here he uses 3 different words to describe it. None used anywhere else in the New Testament. Did you know that? These words used here to describe are not used, these words are not used anywhere else. And so these words are filthiness, foolish talk, and crude joking. Now, the first one is hard to pronounce. I'm going to say that's eiskrotes, translated in the ESV as filthiness, and in other translations as obscenity, baseness, nastiness, dirty talk. The relative adjective eiskros means obscene or disgraceful or offensive, shameful. This filthiness can include obscene, filthy behavior, but the emphasis is on what we would call dirty language. Colossians 3:8 specifically condemns obscene talk from your mouth. In his book on the New Testament synonyms, R.C. Trench says the word includes all the wicked condiments of saucy speech. It's an interesting way of putting it. The phrases we would use to describe it are these, he says: foul-mouthed or toilet tongue, potty mouth or gutter language in our language today. The second noun is morologia, translated here as foolish talk. All right, so let's put this together. Moro, M-O-R-O, logia, if I pronounce it right, L-O-G-I-A. What do you hear there? You hear moron, right? In logia, it sounds like that's the words where we get like the logos, a derivation of the word logos, so in the word that is the word. So I wonder here if it's moronic. When you hear there, yeah, this foolish talk. The first part of those terms comes from the Greek word moros, meaning foolish, silly, or stupid. We get our word moron from it. and attach logia from logos, and we get foolish talk, silly talk, stupid talk. Think of buffoonery or nonsense. Now included, so if you watch SpongeBob, that's a problem. All right, included and condemned here, it's buffoonery. All right, here would be such things as definitely all kinds of obscene language, but also things like insults and racist language and gossip and slander, and much of what is called, ooh, here we go, music or verse. Are there any music lyrics out there today that are troubling? Okay. I don't watch much news anymore. But there was, I don't know at what point I saw this. And I don't even recommend you go and look it up because I don't want this to be in your head. But there's a musician, and she's very crude, obscene, vile. Her name's Cardi B. Okay? She even got to interview Biden during the campaign. How about that? She had a song that Tucker Carlson was speaking about, and the fact that someone who would use that language, I'm talking some of the most vile, filthy things I've ever heard, and she won awards for this song at the Music Awards. It is vile. So when we talk about music in verse, things that are called expressions and so forth and so on, and that's I've told you this story a bunch too, and I'm by no means perfect, but I try to not listen to stuff that has language in it or suggestive things, or if it's songs that I grew up with when I didn't care about such things, if it's something that's like that, I choose not to listen to it. I have a lot of you listen to music on apps. You can set to filter out offensive things, so it won't even try to play. So that's a lot of what I try to do. I mean, like I said, I'm by no means perfect, but that was one of the things that was really important when working with the youth, and even now, I think it's important what we allow into our hearts and minds. Because I will say this: what we hear almost always finds its way out here, right? Have any of you ever spent a good amount of time in a different part of the country where they have a different dialect? What happens to you? You start sounding like them. What's that? Oh, over at the plant? Well, I'll tell you what, that's not that bad. I mean, I was down in parts of North Carolina and Georgia I spent summers down there, and I'd come across people, I'm like, I can't understand a word you're saying. Had such twang to it. But it's true that these things that we allow, and so we have to be very careful what we say. And I'll say this for myself, and maybe you're there with me, it's always something I feel that we can improve upon is what we say and how we say it. It's important. So we talk about insults and racist language and gossip and slander and much of what is called music or verse today. This sort of talk is condemned here, and also by Jesus in Matthew 12:37 when he says, I tell you, on the day of judgment, people will give an account for every careless word they speak. Wow. The word translated careless in the ESV is argon, meaning idle or useless. Now the third noun used here in 5:4 by Paul is eutrapelia. In the Greek world, this term was not necessarily negative. It referred to using language in a witty, joking way, as in playing the role of a clown or joker or court jester. The New Testament, however, sees it not simply as telling humorous jokes or making clever puns, but is referring to crude, coarse, vulgar language, language that is offensive, tasteless, indecent, mean, sarcastic, or hurtful. Various versions translated as coarse jesting, vulgar talk, crude joking, obscene jokes, dirty jokes. We would include risque, double entendres here also. Paul says that all these kinds of language are out of place. They are not appropriate for Christians. They are not fitting in the Christian life. And this, I lost my place. Not fitting in the Christian life. This is equivalent to what he says about sexual immorality and covetousness in verse 3. Such things must not even be named among you as is proper among saints. All these sinful things are not proper. They are not consistent with who we are as redeemed people, set apart from the sinful pagan world. On the other hand, what is fitting and proper? What is fitting and proper then? What does this passage tell us is fitting and proper for Christians in contrast to these three things? Regarding our speech, what does it say? But rather, thanksgiving. Thanksgiving to God. This is a much better way to use our tongue and our speech and our conversation. See, but even beyond this, thanksgiving as such is a lifestyle. This means that we should live our lives as one big act of gratitude to God for His gifts of creation and salvation. We can call this thanksgiving. I do believe that this is a good place to stop. Now, so your clocks worked. Now, we'll say this. When you look at the Ten Commandments, right, and we talk about our speech, what do we find there? Not the lie. Okay, don't take the Lord's name in vain, right? Right? So, I believe this is part of what Donnie covered last week when we talk about the idea of blaspheming, where we take something that is sacred and make it regular, right? So I don't say this to brag or anything, but there are some things that little people in our lives that they get better than we do, right? So we've become accustomed to a few things in our society, and I think it doesn't hit us like it should. All right, now, I'm sorry for asking this question because I know what it's going to bring to mind, but I'm bringing this up to prove a point. We all think of language in kind of like levels of bad words. There's like, well, that's... right? And then a lot of us, and then I'm sorry for bringing this to your mind, would say, well, there's the one really bad word. And I apologize for bringing that to your mind. But our little one said that's when somebody says God out of place, that's the one really bad word. And it is. If you really think about it. Like when someone says OMG or oh my, just taking that which is sacred, right? The name of God and blaspheming it, making it, debasing it, bringing it down. And I was like, maybe we should think of it in those terms, but we don't. I think we allow that to be more common in our lives than it should. And in these scriptures that talk about the Christian law code when it comes to our language and what we accept. Now, I think we've all, as Christians, we've hopefully, in the workplace, in other places you've been, that people who are not Christians, and they know that you're there, they'll try to clean it up a little bit just by your presence.
Sometimes they don't.
Well, yeah, I mean, that's a spiteful person right there. But I mean, I think we've all been in maybe situations when they're like, oh, sorry, preacher. Like, you don't got to answer to me. right? I mean, we all experienced that before. But it's good when people recognize, now, they're not going to do that if you talk the same way they do. They're not going to be convicted at all. Go ahead. I think it depends on how they're saying it. I mean, if they're just using it as some sort of like they stubbed their toe, or let me tell you what right here. The other night, Shalana's like, Daddy, carry me to bed. I'm like, oh, come on. No. She jumped on my shoulders, right? So I'm walking to bed, and I'm being silly. And we have this thing that holds records right by the TV stand. And if I didn't stub 4 of my toes on it, 4 of them, all but the big toe, did I say anything bad? No, I just hoot and hollered for about 5 minutes. But hey, that's when you can really tell what's in someone's heart, when they hit their thumb with a hammer or stub 4 of their toes. But it depends on the context of what they're saying. If they're using it as just an exclamation of like that's rude or coarse, but if they're saying it out of respect and adoration, I think it's the context that determines that. Okay. I mean, really think about that if in that moment, if it was like something like, only the person that's saying it would know their intent. But if it was used in a way that was in a prayerful way for that person, just like if it was a request and, oh my goodness, or oh my Lord, or something like that. But if it, again, choose other. Tim Hawkins does a whole bit, right, on Christian words that we could use in place of other things now that are not profane. That's kind of silly, but if we can avoid things that are close to or whatever, then we don't kind of put ourselves into that situation where we might be profaning His name. Did I hear somebody else offer something there? Yeah. I thought, wasn't there somebody that just said their name? Their own name? Wasn't it some guy I used to work with that just every time he hit his thumb, he said his own name? Or
We used to go to church with a guy, and every time he got hurt, he said, praise the Lord.
Okay.